Shots and camera basics. In this lesson, we'll talk about the various types of shots and camera motion we have at our disposal. What they're typically used for, what they're most effective for, the variations between them, the distinctions between them, how some of them combine into becoming other shots. We're going to talk about this from a 2D perspective in terms of just flat framing, but also a couple of demonstrations of how that stuff looks in 3D. Because I think camera motion and camera moves are better demonstrated in 3D, because then you can really actively see what each of them is doing and what the distinction is between them. I know you'll be familiar with an awful lot of these, so please think of it as a refresher, something to get nice and clear in terms of our terminology, so that when I'm referring to things by certain names, you know exactly what I'm referring to. Because depending on what sphere of the industry you work in, some of these terms, especially for camera moves and things like that, get kind of interchanged. And I think it's important that we just establish that we're all talking the same language here. The first type of shot I've got here as a demonstration is an extreme wide shot. So these are your huge establishing environmental vistas, essentially. Usually they're wide enough so that even a large object or a large character would still appear relatively dwarfed by the scale of the shot here. With all of these terms, they are, as noted here, relative to the goblin character. So this would be an extreme wide shot relative to this goblin character. This would still be a wide shot relative to the ogre as well, even though the ogre is like 10 times bigger than the goblin, right? So what you're typically doing with these shots is, you've got your massive vista, or you've got a very large establishment. So you have a lot of environmental detail. You are very clearly laying out the staging of something. This is where you're going to have your dramatic compositions with large environments in which you're going to be actually active in. The wide shot is more again, relative to the goblin. The character is bigger on the screen now, still very small. The emphasis being on the clarity of the environmental information, the relationship with that character to the environment. It's framing things very clearly within an environmental context. These types of shots are usually used for, say, an establishing type shot early on in the sequence, where you want everyone to know exactly where we are, right? We want to show clearly where the staging is, where all the characters are relative to one another. Or these can also work very well as big dramatic shots, especially if you have a large scale difference like we have in this with the goblins versus the ogre. We're going to have to go wide, in order to get that full size relationship. Next is, you can sometimes refer to these as a medium wide. What this kind of shot gets you is you've got a full body of the character, but you've still got plenty of localized environmental detail, right? You can still tell everything you need to know about the local environment to that character. Really useful for staging, really useful for clear groundwork, to see a character act and perform actions, a dynamic motion through the camera, or lots of Z space action, right? This kind of distance works really well for that, because you can see the character clearly, you can read the silhouette clearly. This is where the silhouette really starts to pay off, more so than details on the character. And so you can usually build enough context within a shot like this. As with all of these shots, it's all about how we use them in conjunction with one another anyway. So we're never going to have an entire film shot on medium wide shots or close-ups. It's all about using an extreme wide shot to establish, then medium wide shots to continue clear groundwork and dynamics, and then close-ups for intimate moments or punctuation on action. Next type of shot then is the medium shot. This is the full body variant of a medium shot. The character is the focus here, right? The environment is not the focus at all. We still have that context. You can still see that we would still pick up environmental detail here. That's typically not what it's about. That doesn't mean it can't be about that, but typically a medium shot is that you are focusing on a character in a full body sense. These are going to play in really well when it comes to those cut-ins for very specific actions or performance beats. The silhouette of the character is going to read really strongly here, but you would also start to pick up facial details as well in these kind of shots. So these can work for a range of action, performance, emotion as well. And getting a little closer each time now. The medium shot, this is the kind of knees, cropped off at the knees type of medium shot. This is a fairly typical framing for a medium. Again, it's just a little bit closer. You're not going to get that full grounded footwork in these kind of framings. Basically, the rule is the more the emphasis needs to be on performance, particularly upper body performance or facial performance, the closer the choice of framing wants to be. Hop in again now, a classic kind of close-up shot here. So this is all about the head and shoulders. We want to be able to read the facial expression perfectly here. We want to get a bit of upper body, so any hand gesturing can still read within the bottom of the frame. And then we have the extreme close-up. So this is all about the expression and the intensity of an expression, right? We really, really want to focus in on the clarity of an expression here. So we're all about the eyes, the nose, the mouth. This is not the body posture. This is all about the emotion of the character. If we really want to hammer it home, we go in for an extreme close-up. Now, there are other extremes as well, you know, like just going right in on an eyeball or something, right? So again, like if you think about how these things fit together, you know, if you went from this kind of framing to an extreme wide framing, like the drama of that would be quite intense. By putting two things like that together, you capture the emotional intensity and then you transfer it onto the epic vista, and then vice versa. You take the epic vista, the scale of that, and then you load that onto a close-up of the character. Incredibly powerful stuff. Another shot type here now is the profile shot. This is just right round to the side. Very dramatic. I find they're incredibly useful for shots where you have a conflict between two characters and you're really trying to intensify the tension between those characters. Like this character is on this side of the screen looking at the profile, the other character is on the other side of the screen looking with the other profile. These work really well as like a still punctuating moment within action. So if you've had an action sequence happening, you've got all these dynamic camera angles and everyone kind of stops, like they ready their weapons. You cut to a profile like this, stillness, allow it to be still, and then boom, he runs forward. It can be very, very effective. Group shot, when you have any number of characters together and you frame them deliberately in such a way as, you know, you want the camera to be taking in a multitude of characters, either 2, 3, 4, however many you want. There are many, many variations of this. Next up is a two shot. This is where we have two characters, usually next to one another. They might be in conversation, but standing side by side typically. Or they might be one behind another. They're usually looking roughly in the same direction, or they might be facing one another, having a conversation within the same shot. It's usually a combination of two characters in a mid-framing, or sometimes a close framing, so that both characters are given prominence on screen, so that any interaction and performance between those characters, they can also end up being part of a larger group type of scenario where you've got multiple characters spread out and two of them are next to one another. So when you cut to either of those characters for a reaction or a dialogue, they're both going to be in it. So there's a number of uses for it. So another one we will use quite often, over-the-shoulder shots serve a number of purposes. As demonstrated here, they're very good for when you have a moment between two characters and they're having a conversation or there's something between them. You see the reverse of the shoulder here. What we're doing here is we're placing the entire emphasis of this shot on these two characters. And we're doing it from the almost perspective of the character that's in the foreground. And we're putting the camera over the shoulder of that character to look at the other character. And this sets up a nice dialogue between the characters. What I love about over the shoulder shots is it keeps the emotional intensity going. There's something about being dirty over the shoulder of another character, like out of focus in the foreground, even though the focus on this would be on the right hand side character here. There's something still very intimate about doing this. This would also play into like lens choice as well, right? Because even though in this particular instance these characters are probably standing about like 2 meters away from one another, right? This isn't like a particularly extreme lens or anything. You can also use very long lenses to push characters that are quite far apart. You could have these characters stood 5-10 meters away from one another and still have them this close to one another in frame using a very long lens. So that gives you the opportunity to keep things really intimate, even though the characters are perhaps a little further apart from one another as well. So they're kind of the connective tissue a lot of the time between shots. You know, they really allow you to hook things up. Also, as well, is if you forget about this character on the right and you imagine that we're over the shoulder of this character here and we're looking at the environment or something way off in the distance, you know, it still keeps that intimacy. You still feel like you're with the character that you're over the shoulder of. And here's an example then of the reverse of that. You know, just kind of slight example of what I've done there with the framing is, so we're over the shoulder of Vedak and we're looking at Artemis here. I've framed Artemis smaller because he is smaller, but I want him to feel smaller as well within the framing. And we have this jagged shoulder piece of Vedak in the foreground here. So everything's kind of like a little bit more intimidating for Artemis. And then when we go to the reverse, it's the opposite, right? So even though we're over at the shoulder of Artemis now, Vedak is big filling up that what would have been negative space, and it's kind of higher than this, right? The high angle, the camera is high looking down on the character. These are very useful for, of course, making a character feel small or giving an important sense of perspective. Like if we were looking down from an ogre's perspective, these are really good. They typically make the character you're looking down on feel smaller and weaker, an underpowered position. It's not always the case. You can still have really dynamic, powerful shots where you're making the character feel powerful looking down. It really depends on the context, but generally speaking, that's what they're good for. You can also play a lot with negative space in these type of framings as well, especially with shadows, as we're doing here. We have the shadow of the ogre dominating the frame here. You can really push that kind of stuff. And this is a much higher, wider example now. These are very, very useful for re-establishing your staging, either establishing them initially or re-establishing the staging of all the characters relative to one another within the environment during the middle of an action sequence, right? You could have been having all these intricate close-ups and everything, and then, okay, you've had maybe, say, 8 close to medium shots in a row, perhaps, and then you're like, I don't know where I am anymore now, and the audience is starting to lose track. Cut to a shot like this. Boom, everyone knows where we are, right? Low angle, great for sense of scale, for a sense of something is overpowering us. The camera's like pushed nice and low to the ground, tilted camera up. You emphasize that sense of scale. It also allows you to dominate the framing with a certain character. Like this character is pretty much taking up that triangle in the center of the frame, right? There's nothing but that character there, and then all the other characters are like tiny little things in the foreground. Super dramatic camera. So a Dutch angle is basically where the camera is at a diagonal. It instantly makes things look more dynamic. It's a little bit of a, if you want a cheap way of making something look more dynamic, put a Dutch on it and it'll get you a good 20% boost how dynamic a shot will feel if you just put a little Dutch on it. This isn't always appropriate on certain things, because it's, I think during action it works well. I guess that's down to each person's sensibilities, but they can be very, very effective. And I think if they're used sparingly, they can really add to the drama of a moment. And I think that's something worth bearing in mind as well, is that all of these options we have available to us, their potency only really works if they're used when they need to be used. Like if we overuse close-ups, they lose their potency. If we overuse extreme wise, they lose their potency. If we overuse Dutching, it loses its potency. Choosing wisely when to use these things. And then we have this is another example of a Dutch, I would say a wide Dutch angle. Again, we just got that diagonal going in the framing, it just kind of off center. Then we have a frontal shot, which is basically like the camera is dead down the line, straight smack down the line, looking down the center of the character, symmetrical, center framing within the frame. That's your frontal shot. And I think of these as like the profile shot. They can be used very effectively for moments of stillness, moments of iconographical framing, like a real symbolic moment. I think that's what works so well with frontal and profile views, is that they reduce the character to an icon, like a silhouetted icon, and can be very powerful. Detail shots are essentially close-ups of part of what's going on in the action, typically a part of a character or a part of a detail of a character's costume. In this case, it's the hand holding the strap of the shield firmly, and you would see the tension in the hand, you'd see the strap tense. Or it could be like the visor being brought down, or it could be the sword being clenched, or it could be a glimmer of light on the blade of the sword, something like that, right? It's just a little punch in on something for a detail. Cutaway shot then is a shot of something not directly related to the action that's happening. If we're having a fight in the environment, and like that's the emphasis, right? And let's say, I'll give you an example. Let's say one of the characters just got smacked, or is just about to get smacked by the ogre or something, right? Instead of showing that play out explicitly, what you could do is you just cut away to somewhere in the environment, like a pillar or a piece of woodland, or in this case, a skull on the floor nearby. And nothing's happening in the shot, right? It's just a static cutaway to a skull, which is unrelated. And then into shot, bang, comes the character, right? Skids into shot or crushes the skull or something like that. So what it allows you to do is it allows you to take a breather from the action. It allows you to kind of get yourself out of trouble if you're in trouble. They're really great for this, right? So I guarantee this will happen at least once or twice when you're working your way through this course, is you'll get trapped in your staging. Like you've got yourself into a way like, oh, I know this stuff's working great here. And then you think, oh God, I don't know what to do next, right? I don't know how to finish this off clearly. And then you are stuck, right? just cut to something, cut to a cutaway, and you can just reset then. Everything, once you cut away, everything else that's going off camera is completely resetting itself. And now you've got an easy out, basically. But you, like I said, you can connect these cutaways back to the action, like by having someone enter the frame or something. Now let's take a look at common camera motions. There's pretty much just one, and that's pan. However the camera moves, it's just a pan. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. This is a bit of a camera meme, a bit of fun. Yeah, you'll often find that everything will be referred to as a pan. This can, of course, lead to an enormous amount of confusion when a more correct type of terminology is more like this range that we've got here. Now, what we're talking about is how to describe a very specific motion of the camera. Now, the reality is that more elaborate camera moves are a combination of any number of these things, but these are the terms that directly correlate to the specific motions of a camera. So the first we have is a dolly, which means that the camera is moving forward or backwards in a straight line. A boom or a jib is where the camera will move upwards or downwards in vertical space, so vertically. All of these terms originally come from the types of apparatus, or most of them anyway, the type of apparatus that would actually be used physically on them in live action filming. So like a boom jib is like an arm. Because we're working in a digital space here, we're much freer about the way we can do all this stuff. And since the advent of Handycam and Steadicam, especially in live action, a lot of this stuff can be combined in ways that it never could before. It was quite a revolutionary camera, the Steadicam, when it came along. So anyway, right, we've got boom and jib, which is up and down. Then we've got truck, which indicates a horizontal left to right motion of the camera. Then we have a pan, which is a rotation on the left to right. So if you imagine turning your head to look from left to right or right to left, that's what a pan is. A tilt is a vertical pan. So it's, again, with your head, look up and then look down, look up and look down. That's a tilt. A roll is where the camera will roll on its axis to get you that Dutch framing that we've talked about. And then you have an orbit, which is where the camera will be focused on kind of one place, but the camera will orbit around it, like the way that the moon orbits the Earth. Okay, so let's take a look at how these translate into 3D, because it's much, much clearer once you actually just see what they look like in 3 dimensions. Dolly. So a dolly, as mentioned, is where the camera pushes forwards and backwards through the environment. On all of these, on the bottom, we have the staging view. So we're outside of the camera, and at the top, we have the through camera view. So you can see exactly how those two things correlate. So you can see it kind of pushing right through the middle. This is great for like if you're on center framings and you'd want to do that push in, push in, push in on the center framing. It's great stuff. You tend to get a lot of parallax in doing this from the objects that are around in it. Boom jib. This is where the camera will go upwards, downwards, vertically in space. Great for kind of booming up and taking in an environment or revealing something over a horizon, something like that, you know. The truck is a horizontal motion. So from left to right, you know, correlating to the angle we're looking at it right now. You can see from the top view, it's just going side to side. Again, you get a lot of parallax in here because the camera is translating a lot through the environment. Pan, as discussed, is basically like turning your head left and right. So we go right here and then we go all the way back to the left. You'll see from the top down view, that's all it's doing, is not moving. You don't get any parallaxing at all happening in the image doing this. We have a variation on the pan called a whip pan, which is when you perform the rotation really quickly to get from point A to point B. So you can close great distances very, very quickly. So if you look at this version here, you'll see that it's the same principle. It's a pan, it's a rotation, but it's just really fast. So what this gets you is a lot of energy between the starting point and the end point. You can do a whip pan and you'll close that distance instantly. It adds a lot of punch and can be very dynamic. Tilt is a vertical pan. So you're standing there, you're looking up and you're looking down. You're only tilting your head up and down, as you can see here, up, then down, same thing. Roll is where we rotate the camera from our point of view. That's kind of the way I think of it. That's the effect that gets, and all that's happening there is you're rotating on a particular axis there. Orbit is where the camera is orbiting around the a focal point, basically, right? So in this case, the focal point is the character, and as you can see from the top-down view, the camera is just orbiting around. So as we talked about, all of those different types of camera motions can be combined into various other types of camera motions. A tracking shot is where the camera is following a specific focal interest through the environment. So let's say a character running through an environment. This is a Steadicam version. So I'll play this now. And what we've got is we're tracking this character along, and you can see the camera's doing all sorts at the bottom, right? It's moving all the way around the place. It's going down, it's going up, it's turning around and everything, just following him. And you can see though that the motion is quite smooth and stable. This is sort of typical of what a Steadicam version of this would be. So even though the camera is moving quite elaborately, the framing and the feel of the camera is still nice and steady. Now, the other end of that scale is the handheld version, which is going for that much more, I guess, lived in the moment, like as if you were an actual cameraman running along without using, like, you know, gyros and things to stabilize the camera. You'll see immediately the difference then between the Steadicam version and the handheld version. You can see the motion in the camera. The actual pathing and everything is identical. The camera's identical. I've just put some handheld camera motion on it, and you can just see the kind of energy and the immersion if you're going for that kind of look, right? Let's take a look at lensing and focal length now. I'm only going to be referring here to the focal length. Focal length is always relative to whatever camera type you're using. There are a million other variations dependent on what type of camera you're using or trying to mimic digitally that I'm not going to accommodate for here. I'm just going to be talking with the standard Blender camera and how the focal length pertains to that. The lower the focal length, the wider the lens. Wider lenses allow you to take much more of the environment in, but it also creates more contrast in size between close objects to distant objects. And then also, the wider the lens is, the more distorted the image starts to get, and more exaggerated the perspective. Zoom. Zoom is the effect achieved by extending and retracting the focal length. So we're going to zoom in bit by bit here now. You can see the camera doesn't move, but the lens is being extended to around 100. And you can see in the difference in the diagram at the bottom there, the camera hasn't moved, but the lens is extended. And what that's given us now is it's massively compressed the space in the direction that we're looking. So what was an extreme wide shot is now actually a really intimate, like almost over the shoulder, but at the hand level between these two characters. So this I was kind of talking about earlier about like the way that in an over the shoulder situation, you can use a long lens to compress the space between two characters who are in conflict with one another, even if they're 30 meters apart or something. Another variation on the zoom. So if we come from a very, very wide angle to a very, very long angle here, and we push in on this character's face, and then we apply more speed, we get what's called a crash zoom. So this is the same action, but done much faster. It really crashes the camera forward at great speed, even though the camera isn't moving here. It's just the focal length being extended very, very quickly. Gets you the sense that you're being rushed in towards that character. And it allows us to go from a very wide framing to a very close framing almost instantly, like very quickly. Again, very stylized use of a camera, but very effective when used correctly. Lensing in relation to the distance from the subject and some common focal lengths. In this example, we've got a set of lenses set up here on the camera. These are fairly standard lens lengths, 18, 24, 35, 50, 70, 100, 200. Then I've thrown a really long lens, 500 in there. And what I've done is I've set this up in the initial example much further away from the character here. So we begin on a much wider framing. And then in the second example, we've got those same lenses, but positioned much closer to the character to begin with. Something you'll notice on this further framing here as we go up with the long lenses is that the character remains fairly flat. There is no distortion that starts to happen on that character the longer the lens goes, because we aren't moving the camera closer. It's almost like going closer and closer on a flat image. And then when we begin much closer, you can see that those wider lenses distort the character more. And as we go up and up and up, you see that that distortion changes and starts to flatten out then as we go up the lenses. If we look at them side by side, on the top we have the camera that's farther away from the subject, and on the bottom we have the camera closer to the subject, and the comparative focal lengths you need to get similar framings. So on the bottom one, I've gone from my widest lens, which is the 18mm, and in order to roughly match the size of that on screen, I had to use a 100mm lens on the furthest framing. Then when we look at this second example, on the closer framing, I've got 24mm. On the farther framing, it's 200mm. So it's a massive difference in the focal length you need in order to frame that character at the same size on screen. And then the final example is the 70mm here on the bottom is matched to a roughly 500mm lens on the farther framing. And the other interesting thing you can notice here as well is that you see that the values, because we're closer, there's less atmosphere between us and the subject, and so it retains its darker values. Whereas on the top image, you can see that it's getting pushed back a little there because there's more volumetric between us and the character because we're further away. Wider lenses are often associated with a more subjective experience because we are positioned closer to that character. So we feel a closer presence to that character on screen with a wider lens, whereas a longer lens is a much more objective, observational feeling because we are actually further away from that character. Let's take a look at what lenses do to a sense of speed, motion, and scale on established camera moves. So the orbit I showed earlier, I've basically taken that and I've done 2 extra lens types on it. So the original was 35mm and I've done a 100mm and a 200mm, so you can see the difference. You see what it does in terms of the amount of motion that feels like it's happening horizontally. As that orbit goes around here now, the scale of that environment feels enormous. The motion in the background, the longer the lens, the more horizontal motion you're going to feel in the background. So keep that in mind. And then when we take a look at this tracking shot here, I've gone quite extreme on this 8mm. I've got the 24mm, which is the original, and then 70mm. And you can see the difference in the sense of speed, right? The wide angle lens, because we're moving through space here, especially as it gets down here and we're running across the ground, a wide angle lens is taking in more of the environment. So even though we're moving the same distance, it feels faster on the screen. Whereas with a longer lens, because a longer lens compresses space, you don't get that same sense of speed. It kind of slows the sense of speed into the frame or forward through space, but it amplifies the size of things on screen. There's of course a lot more to lenses than this, but that's the general wide lens versus long lens ends of the spectrum.